Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I didn't quite understand it would be like a lecture, so I didn't plan this as a lecture, really. So I'm basically going to start by asking you questions. So I'm going to present a real historical paper. So it's not a course in history, like to introduce you in history. I'm basically presenting my research. So I'm going to try to get you into my research. And this is going to be that who knows already what the GAL codes are? No one, right? Not very much. So I need to spend a lot of time explaining you why it's worth researching the GAL code as a historian, why I choose to do that, okay? So to know your perspective, before I start talking, wait a minute, I have a few questions to ask you. So this is an extract, this is an excerpt from the GAL codes that will come back. So this is just, why is it moving without me, right? Okay, let's do that. So I have 3 questions for you. I hope it doesn't move without me asking. Before I explain you why it's worth researching the GAL codes, it's something interesting to understand the structure of economics and why the structure of economics is changing. So before I get into that, I need to know basically what kind of course you have taken already. So which course did you have? So you're in the 3rd year mostly, right? So what have you been studying so far? Like you're all economics students. Yes, but which course? Which topic? Which methods? Yeah.
Because I studied already a lot of macro and micro.
Okay.
But mostly out of the view of neoclassic.
Okay. So you mean maximization techniques and stuff like that?
Yes.
Okay. Any field already? Like development? Did you study development economics? Which field? Do you all study the same fields, or do you get to choose what you want to study, like in the 3rd year?
We get to choose.
So between what?
You can go towards microeconomics, classical microeconomics. You can do macro. I did something more like development economics and economics of migration.
Okay.
It's very different.
Do you have like urban economics, public economics, things like that?
I think we do.
Okay.
I didn't take them, but there are classes.
So all of you are not specialized?
Yes.
So you seems to be basically doing a lot of macro. Was that true? Okay. Then my second question, which is not second here, but never mind. So you're taking a lot of different techniques, different theories probably at that level. And so but my underlying questions, my question is what unifying features do you see in this course? And my underlying question is why, it goes with the next question, how would you define economics and why did you go into that? Why did you choose to study economics rather than, for instance, sociology or psychology? I gather you studied a bit of management, but what makes you study economics? Yeah.
To understand the way the economy works and how it intertwines with society, like what predictions can we actually make about how the economy is going to evolve in the next years or decades. It's like
Okay. But then how do you, for instance, do you do development economics?
no.
No. Or macro? How do you distinguish that you're studying macroeconomics rather than, like, for instance, if you study poverty or inequality, I guess everyone is studying inequality because this is really a hot topic in economics right now. So how do you know that you're studying inequality as an economist rather than as a sociologist, for instance?
I think maybe it's a different approach to discover the society.
So how is that different?
It tries to, yes, I think it's kind of more like science than art.
Okay. We're just jumping from one definition to another. So what makes it scientific? That's true. I'm going to talk about classifying economics to make it like a science or to make it science. But what makes it a science, basically, for you?
Yeah, I think maybe it's about numbers that we try to explain or to search solutions by using mathematics and statistics.
Okay, and like, so maybe it's you, someone else say, I'm studying macro, but more with like neoclassical techniques. Is that what you mean by neoclassical?
Yes.
Mathematics and data? And so sociology would be more like what, for instance? Yes?
Talking about groups and dynamics and movements, things like that.
Without math?
Yeah, you can do that. Like what constitutes a movement, what are common goals, what are things like that.
Okay.
Maybe.
Maybe it's more like having an opinion and testing it empirically. It's not about models and mathematics and
You mean sociology or economics?
yeah, sociology.
Oh, so for you, sociology is more empirical than economics is. Okay. Which is not actually, but we'll come back to that later. Yes?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say, that both science try to search solutions by testing empirical questions.
So what do you mean by testing them?
Yeah, they use statistical methods to find solutions or to prove solutions.
Okay.
But I think that, and that's what I wanted to mention, is that economics try to use models, but in the way of like physics or biology builds a model.
Mm-hmm. Closer to exact science, you mean, for instance?
Yes.
Okay. So you see the point. Everyone here has been taking several courses in whether it's explicit or not, and it's not explicit when you're in bachelor, but it's getting more explicit if you go on a master degree. You have an opinion on what counts as economist and what doesn't count as economist, okay? So how it is and how you want it to be, okay? If you're a group that advocates more pluralism, for instance, you were giving an interview when I came in, but that's the whole point. It means you're probably dissatisfied with the techniques that are being used or the approach that are being used or the separation between economics and other science, whatever, okay? This is not a problem. So I'm going to jump. The problem here is that you're not being confronted with economic research directly, and so I'm going to take you and just throw you into the daily business of doing economic research, okay? Because as a historian, I study what economists do on a daily basis. So this is my questions. So the problem is that you're being given lots of bits of theories like ISLM or optimization. You've probably been introduced to behavioral economics, that people don't behave rationally in the face of risk, stuff like that, or inequality or development. So a whole bunch of stuff. And I remember what was really difficult for me when I was an undergraduate student was how can I get a picture of economics as a whole, okay? And if you don't have one, it's difficult to communicate about being an economist to your friends or where they're asking, what are you doing? That was my first question. What are you doing in your course? And no one's ever respond because you're doing all bits of stuff. And what you want to get at is what is economics? What is the whole of economics? What are the frontiers of my discipline? What is its structure? How it looks like? So historians are doing that, and philosophers are doing that. How do historians can approach the whole of economics or try to describe the whole of economics? There are many ways to do that. So the one good way to do that is which you've probably done in your first course, is defining economics through its principle, okay? Like, I don't know if you work with the Mankiw in Germany, so it's a very famous textbook called Principle of Economics, and it begins with 10 things that are typically economics, like reasoning at the margin, scarcity, and things like that, aggregation. So one way to study economics, what is unifying economics, is to study its core principle and how they have changed. So some historians have done that. They have, so I have a reference, there is a paper, I'm going to send you a paper if you want, by Backhouse and Medema. These are two historians. What they've done is that they have taken textbook or books about what it's like to, what are the boundaries of economics since like the 18th century. And they've looked at the definition of economics in there and how it changed through times. And they give you a good example of what is the core of economics and how it changed. And what they show, so you have a textbook from the 30s by someone called Lionel Robbins. So basically at the turn of the 20th century, economics was very much about wealth. And then Robbins turned it into a science of scarcity. How to find ends to fulfill, how to use means to fulfill ends, and all the means are scarce. Okay, so that was a science of scarcity that was here. After the war, someone called Paul Samuelson, who just died a few years ago, he was like, you can picture him as the father of mathematical economics. Okay, he studied economics at Harvard. He was very much influenced by physicists, and he wanted economics to be more like physics. That's what he said. So these ideas emerged in the 19th century, but it was put in a very famous textbook just after the war. And from that moment on, mathematical economics was on the rise. Okay, so he has his own definition of economics, and Mankiw also has principle. And what they show is that first, doing economics was about studying production and wealth and money. It became studying scarcity, and now it's more about studying rational choice. If you ask an economist what you're doing, he says, I've got tools, and I tend to consider people as rational and as making rational decisions, and I'm trying to apply my rational decision framework to all sorts of issues. Urban issues, development issues, even family issues, the number of kids you have, or drugs. Do I want to take drugs or whatever? Okay. So this is one way to understand what economics is about. Look at all the textbook in the past centuries and see how the definition changed. And you have like a core of what economics is about. Another way to do it is to look into what economists do. And what economists do, mostly, they write journal articles. So this is a part you don't really see as undergraduates. But for instance, if you study general equilibrium, have you heard about that? So maybe you've got these names, Kenneth Arrow and Gerard Debreu, or maybe not, but actually general equilibrium, the idea that economics is about market interacting with each other and producing something that is optimal or not optimal depending on the condition, these ideas and the math that is behind, it was actually fashioned into some papers by these two American, well, this one is American, Kenneth Arrow, and Gerard Debreu is French, but it immigrated in the United States. So it's a paper dated 74, and this is how economics work. Economics are thinking about new ideas, and they are publishing them. And then they are publishing them, and people teach them, and it goes into textbook, and if it's successful, it can even go into policy, okay? But it always, well, it mostly begins with some papers. And compared with other science, like sociology, psychology, geography, whatever, economics is extremely hierarchical. There is 5 top journals and tens and hundreds of others. And if you want to be among the best economists in the world, you have to publish in these top 5 journals. That's the game. That's really what economists do every day. Okay? So you've got 3 of them here: the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, and Econometrica. Okay? So the way economics ideas are produced are through journal article. This is one example. This is the major article in general equilibrium. 2 about things you may know. Did you study information imperfection? The market for lemon? Not yet. The idea that if you don't know all information about what you're selling or buying, there might not be a market, or you have to signal the quality of what you sell, for instance. So that's a paper too, by someone whose name is George Akerlof and who got the Nobel Prize for that. He's the husband of the current chair of the Fed, of Janet Yellen. Okay. So he has a Nobel Prize. And he also wrote that extremely famous paper that has been cited tens of thousands of times by other economists and other scientists. Okay? And that's a paper on what is called behavioral economics. So behavioral economics is the idea that actually people, so it was written by an economist and a psychologist, and they begin to investigate, so they begin this in the late 70s. They didn't believe that people behave rationally in the face of risk. For instance, they feel loss more than they like gains and stuff like that. So they began doing experiments to actually test that. So they had a whole body of evidence that people don't really behave rationally in life. And this is also stuff they published in papers. And then it went into textbooks, and when it went into policy. If people don't react well to risk, what can we do? For instance, to foster entrepreneurship and stuff like that. Okay, so this is quite cool for historians, because all what economists produce is there in papers, and now their papers are being numerized and they are online in a big database. Okay, so it's very easy to do algorithms that are going to search and classify automatically what economists do. Okay. So some economists have done that. Some historians, sorry. So François Claveau and Yves Gingras, they just published last year. So this is what they did. All what economists, not the books, but the article economists have published since like the end of the 19th century are in a big database called Web of Science. So tens of thousands of paper. So they have done an algorithm. In the algorithm, so when you write a paper, you cite other economists before, so because you agree or you disagree, so you built on previous economists, okay? So you have the paper with the ID, and at the end of the paper, you get a whole set of reference. So this is the paper I sent you, and like everyone else, at the end of my paper, I've got all the ideas of other people I use, basically. So the algorithm does that. It looks at who one paper cite and who other paper cites, and when citations are pretty close to each other, it pulls it together, okay? So it does cluster automatically, okay? So it takes the whole body of all what economists have ever written and cluster them together automatically, okay? So this is the result, okay? And the cluster, of course, the cluster changed through times. And then they look into what kind of paper in that cluster, and they give names. So you have, so this is, for them, the structure of economics. So they start in 1960, because this is a period economists were writing a lot of papers, and it's up to now, okay? So it's not them that are some economists are interested in development, and other in macro, and other in money, and other of finance. It's automatic, okay? Clusters come from the algorithm, okay? So you see it here. You get a big cluster that is pretty stable about firm, because some economists just always studied how entrepreneurs make decisions and take risk and finance their activity and stuff like that. Here you have an education cluster that become a big wage cluster, because why there are inequality in wage is a big problem, but it doesn't stay stable. You have a big rate cluster. This is all about monetary economics, okay? So here you have a map of economists in the post-war, after World War II, basically, okay? So it's a totally different way to do it. You just have a huge database, and you ask a computer to actually classify papers together. Do you understand that? And then you can, so it's an application that is online that you can visit. And so you can stop at every period of time, every year you want. And so here you get the whole chronology of what economists, you get the whole of economists, the whole of what economists have produced since the 60s. And here you've got the year I stopped, I don't remember. So it's 84. So it's a time window. And you have what economics look like in that year, what economists were interested in, okay? So, and you can actually play it, so it's changing across time, and you see the clusters moving, okay? So it's a totally different way of doing history, a very recent one, building on what we can do with computer now to study the past of economics and understand how economics is shaped. So this is not what I'm doing. Why? Because I want to understand, I want a picture of how economists have changed, like in the past 100 years, for instance. But I want also to have an idea of how economists themselves conceived economics, their own field, thought about their own. And if the thing with the paper and the algorithm, you don't have that, okay? It's just automated. For instance, there is a very important book at the turn of the 70s that was published by an economist called Nancy Ruggles. And she is trying at the beginning of the book to explain, so it's a book published by the Social Science Research Council. So it's a book on economics to explain what economics is in 70 to non-economists. So she's trying to do exactly what I'm trying to do here, so to get at the essence of what economist is. And she writes, economic theory represents the core of the discipline. And core is a very important word. I will come back to that. Every economist is trained in economic theory and applied his concept and mechanism to problem in his own special field. Although micro and macroeconomic theory have different paths of evolution, they are closely related and are gradually becoming more unified. Okay? So she's saying basically economist has a core, and that core is a set of techniques, a bit like what you say, and that are first a set of techniques in micro and macro. And then when you master, this is what you do in the 2 first years, you begin to do optimization techniques and probability. And when you master that set of techniques, you go in and apply it to a set of problems. Development, public economics, if you want to understand why the government takes the decision it takes. Family, macro, money, finance, firm, entrepreneurship, all sorts of things, okay? This way of seeing economics is very recent because it emerged at that time, okay? And I want a technique that allows me to understand how did it emerge, to see it, okay? That economics you're studying today, how it became that way, how it became so unified. A big difference between economics and other science is that economics is often perceived as ways more unified than is sociology or psychology or geography, for instance, okay? And one of my questions is, why is it so? What ties various questions in economics together? How do you know that this is economics and this is not? Okay, this is important to understand. So this is why, so one way to do that is to study, so I'm going to explain what it is, what is called the GL codes. So in economics, I told you, when you research economics, what economists do is basically publishing papers with ideas and data and trying to get these ideas into policy, to raise tax if they believe that tax should be raised, or to lower tax if they believe that's how you're going to have more growth, or change the tax if you believe, or the wage tax or the excise tax if you believe this is how to solve inequality, whatever, okay? So these ideas start with papers. And all the papers that I told you about, they're classified, okay? So this is one paper that is very famous by someone called Matthew Jackson that explains the basis of mechanism theory. Mechanism theory is about creating a market. It's a course you didn't have, but for instance, if you want to allocate phone spectrum, for instance, you can do it. You can choose the 4 biggest companies in the country and give them a spectrum, or you can do it through auctions. And now we are doing more and more stuff through auction. Okay, and that's recent. Economists turn to auction to allocate all kinds of stuff, all kinds of big utilities in various countries, only in the 80s. It's been around for decades, but it really became a field. And if you go into master, you might specialize in mechanism design, how to create a market, for instance, how to create a financial market, or how to create a market for water, or how to create a market for carbon, or whatever. You can do that. That's a field of economics. Okay, so this is a paper that describes all this field. And you see here, it's classified. Okay, this stuff These are called the GL codes, okay? So where does it come from? The biggest association of economists in the world is the American Economic Association, okay? Tens of thousands of economists. They have a big meeting in January, the first weekend of January every year, with like 12,000 economists that are exchanging ideas in a city. So the AEA and most of what is the new ideas that are being thought in economics are being thought in the United States. This might be good or this might not be good, but you can see if you look at the list of Nobel Prize in economics that most of them might not be American but work in the US. Okay, when someone not working in the US get the Nobel Prize, it's an exception. Okay, so the American Economic Association is what represents economics worldwide, basically. Okay, and this association, because there were so many economists doing so many different things worldwide and they wanted a unity in that, for a reason I will explain, they have developed a classification system, okay, which is called the GL codes. What they do with that classification system, that they give it some number to all the paper published, so basically to all the ideas thought by economists. They use it also, for instance, to recruit. If you're being, at the beginning it was the case only in the US, but now at that big meeting of the American Economic Association, for instance, Freie Universität Berlin, maybe, recruit economists there, okay? And what the university does, what the economic department does, says, I want an economist. For instance, I want a macroeconomist or a monetary economist, or there is a code for that. So put an ad in a centralized system with a code, and then audition people, and then recruit. So if you want to recruit, if you want to recruit to development economics, that's another code. Okay. The problem, of course, and if you want to recruit someone that does evolutionary economics, or someone that does very new computing, like studying economics with computing algorithm, that's very new, and there might not be a code. So you might not be able to recruit someone. So that's a problem. Do you understand what I'm saying? So these codes have been around for since the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, so this is what I did, basically. And this is how American economics and mostly economists worldwide think about their discipline. Okay, if you go to professional economists and say, tell me what economics is about, it's going to tell you there is a core, like it said, and the core is micro, macro, and a set of mathematical techniques and statistics. And then this is applied to a whole range of fields. And what he has in mind is actually that classification. That's what shapes what economist is for in economics. Okay? So it won't use the D or E or J or whatever, but it corresponds to micro, macro, public economics, law and economics, public choice, like studying governmental decisions and stuff like that. Okay? So this is a screen capture of the website of the American Economic Association that introduced economics to non-economists. Okay? So economists organize their discipline in field from agricultural economics to urban economics. Okay? So you learn a set of techniques and then you go into specializing, which is what you're going to do if you pursue economics. You're not going to keep doing the whole of economics. You're going to specialize in a set of problems that you find interesting. Okay? And no one knows how this classification that really shapes the mental view economists have of our field was developed. So this is what I did. As a historian, I wanted to understand what unites this whole field together. If there is more than a century ago or less than a century ago, if the questions economic are being interested in are changing or the tools are changing, and what keeps uniting all this together for centuries. So I did just that. I went to the archive. I went to the archive of the American Economic Association, and I tried to look into how this classification was made. Because I thought if I couldn't understand how the classification was made, I could understand the boundaries and how the boundaries of economics were changing. Okay? So this is what the paper is about. understanding the classification to understand the field of economics and what binds various questions and techniques together, okay? Because if you want to put all the papers in all the economists or all the job market candidates into a set of code, you have to think a lot about your own discipline. You have to identify the new things that are going on. For instance, economics has not always been mathematical. So at which point did we decide that we need a code for mathematical economics? Economics has not always been experimental. Now there are lab experiments being conducted on people in labs to understand how they react, how they make decisions, how much risk do they take or are they not willing to take, etc. And you can do this, you can observe people on the street, or you can put people in a situation, ask them questions, and see how they react. And this is very recent. We've been doing experiments in Economists since the late 60s, okay, approximately. So how does it emerge? And how do people take notice? And how does it become a good way of doing economics? Other things never became good ways of doing economics, or other ways of doing economics, for instance, describing institution in development was fashionable, for instance, in the 50s, and are not fashionable anymore, okay? If you think that, for instance, there is too much math in economics, you believe that other methods that are legit are not recognized for what they are, okay? It means that they don't have a code anymore, or they are not classified anymore, or whatever, okay? So classifying economics is important because you have to identify a new approach or a new problem, you have to name it, and you have to put it in your framework. Is it core, or is it applied, or is it important, or is it secondary, or whatever? So when you do that, you basically build an image of your discipline, okay? And not everyone agree on how to do it. So this is what I was looking in the archive. Do people basically agree, for instance, that mathematical economics is core, or do they not? When does it start agreeing? How much time did it take? Okay? So I'm going to show you different classification, how the classification evolved over time, because so far I'm just telling you about something you've never seen, okay? So I'm going to show you the various classification, and then I'm going to focus on specific issues, okay? I'm going to focus on the relationship between theory and applied, and I'm going to focus on how they made the macro and micro category, especially the macroeconomics category was really hard to do. And this is what you're all studying, and I want you to understand how hard it was to understand what macroeconomics was, okay? And how late it came. So the first classification, it was implemented at the beginning of the 20th century when the American Economic Reviews, so the most famous journal and the most prestigious journal economics was created, okay? So the top economists were publishing top ideas in there, and they wanted to, the new editor just didn't want to have it as they come, he wanted to organize them. So we thought, I'm going to use a classification. We don't really know how this classification was made, but you can see that it was pretty small. You will see that it has grown very large. And you can see, so it was not ordered. There is no number. There is no letter. What is here is not more important than what is here. And for instance, in other journal, it was ordered alphabetically, okay? So just because there is general work theory and history at the top, doesn't mean it's more important. It's just like that, okay? And it changes. So, and you can see what economists are interested in at the beginning of the century. And as I told you already, it's a lot about production and wealth, okay? How do we produce, manufacture, agriculture, some service, transportation and communication, trade, how we finance it, labor. So it's a lot about production and the condition for production, okay? So that's how it was at the beginning of the century. And that's how it became after the war. So I'll come back to the debates that lead to this change after, okay? So after the war, we're in a very specific situation. It's difficult to remember now because economists is often considered like the queen social science, or a social science that would be more scientific than other. That's the kind of ideas that are being around. There is a paper that has been published last year. It's called The Superiority of Economists. So this is sociologists that investigated why economists feel superior to other scientists. Yes?
Why is the war such an important benchmark for the economy?
Because this is, so the war was extremely important because this is the moment where the economists were really put to work. Yeah, basically you needed to gather all the resources that was in the United States, but it also was the same in the UK and to a lesser extent in France. It was a moment you really had to win a war, and this is the moment politicians understood that the war was not going to be won only on ideological or military ground. You need to have an economic system that produces weapons very quickly, and this is a huge machine. This is an economic problem. Exactly the scarcity stuff I told you about. The big war issue is how do you allocate the worker you have, and the funding you have, and the iron you have, and the bread you have to the war effort. What do you build with that? Do you build more plane, or more school, or more submarines, or whatever? It's just a big, giant economic calculation issue. Okay, so this is what economists were brutally confronted with, and they developed new techniques, often mathematical techniques. They were helped by physicists, they were helped by statisticians, they were helped by physicists because most of the physicists who brutally immigrated from Germany and the UK and France to the US didn't necessarily work as physicists. A lot of them came to work as economists during the war. So this is a watershed because in just 4 years, the 4 war years, economics became kind of a not prestigious science, but politicians and physicists and hard scientists came to understand that this was a new science that was useful, that has proved its uses, okay? But it was not stabilized. So the main issue of economists after the war is that they had new set of techniques that looks interesting for politicians, but at the same time they were talking about money, they were talking about wages, they were talking about unions, and for many, many people, politicians and physicists and mathematicians, social science was a bit like socialism. You know, it was the McCarthy era after the war, okay? So social science was suspicious. So what economists needed to do, they needed to show how their science was scientific, really, okay? So they tried to argue that it was devoid of ideology, which is why they endorse, I'm going fast here, but the idea is that this is why they endorse the model of physics, and that's why they mathematize their science so much, okay? And this is also what they're trying to do in the classification. The classification changed, so you see the big difference is that now all the fields of economics are ordered in 3. So this is meant to introduce economics as a science, okay? To librarians, to politicians, to students, to the government, because the government also needed to recruit economists, okay? So you had it to provide a list that could classify papers, economists, all sorts of stuff, okay? So it shows that you've got methods and scientific methods, 3 methods. At that time you got theory. History was yet as good a method as theory, which is not anymore. In theory you had mathematical economists, you had a field. And you have statistical methods. I mean, it was new, okay? So you took that method and then you applied it to aggregates, which was to become macro, but was not macro yet. It was all about money, the business cycle. It was also, this period was the beginning of national accounting, okay? Before the war, you didn't really know how much a country produced. You couldn't calculate this. National accounting, so calculating the GDP, is also a war effort. It was also kind of invented because of the war, okay? So you have all this, applying this methodology, so this scientific methodology to business fluctuation, to aggregates, and then to all sorts of other issues, fields. Also often dealing with production, okay? So of course, you have things that are common with what was before. It's still the same economics, but it's really presented differently. Why? Because economists wanted to have a public image, and they use a classification to say, here is what we're doing as economists. You don't know us a lot, because we're a new science, but here is what we're doing, okay? We're doing scientific stuff, okay? So the next revision, it was in 56. And you see the classification is really growing, okay? So economics is really successful, more successful, and it's really expanding, okay? It is still fighting to be established as a science, as much as a science as physics or mathematics or biology, okay? So it's still very much about signaling the scientificity of economics in there, okay? So you get more and more fields in there, okay? So you still have, so you see the beginning of having a core on the top. Price theory, income theory, it's about growth. So it's the beginning of studying growth. History of thought is still very much important. It's going to decrease afterwards, but it's still important. Economic development is a key topic because it's a Cold War. And if you really want to win the Cold War, you have to help developing countries develop towards democracy. Okay, this is what Americans were thinking. Okay, at that time, you get more and more statistics, and in statistics you get new methods. For instance, input-output. Input-output is exactly what I explained you about the war effort. There's big calculation representing a whole economy to be able to know how this worker should go and how this bread should go and corn should go and stuff like that. So more calculation. So you see, economics is growing. So next revision of the classification, we've shrinked a lot, okay? But you don't want to misinterpret this. So, so you see, that's, I didn't mention that, but that's two classification when you have numbers. So you have an order, which you didn't have at the beginning. Okay, so economics is being ordered. In here, so why do you have, you change the ordering and the number and you shrink the number of topics in economics? It's because at that time, economics has been established as a science, as a useful science. It doesn't need to fight or to signal to outsiders. One watershed, for instance, in the United States, if you want, is when Kennedy was president. He was listening to economists much more than all presidents before him, and he implemented a big tax cut to have a huge growth, and that's usually considered a proof that economists are being heard by policy, that they are being successful, that they are being recognized as a science, okay? So the problem is not anymore about showing your science to the world, okay? This revision is oriented toward economists, and the problem is that in that decade is that so many people are starting doing economics that you don't know what to read anymore, okay? You need to read literally thousands of papers. There are too many submissions to journals, there are too many publications, there are too many journals you have to read. It's a mess, okay? And this is the beginning, this is the moment computers are really on the rise, okay? So what they do is they use the classification as an information processor, okay? So they shrink the number of categories, not because economics is shrinking, but because they want to computerize it, okay? So for your purpose is not the most important classification. The most important one is the last one. So this is the classification as it is now. Okay? This is what economists is for economists right now. Okay? So this was established 25 years ago and it hasn't changed since. Okay. And in this final revision, you see the core. You see, so you got two introductory categories, mathematical and quantitative method, microeconomics, macroeconomics, and you didn't have that before, okay? And then a whole set of fields, more and more fields, to which these techniques are being applied. So you have a core applied structure, okay? Which is more or less how you described economics to me when I asked you at the beginning. We use a specific set of techniques that other sciences are not other social science are not using. Okay, so you got old field that have been there since the very beginning. International economics has always been there. Public economics is about how do you fund the government, has always been there. But you get new fields that has emerged in the post-war. For instance, health and education. It's new. It's new that economists have something to say about health and education. Okay, like 50 years ago, thinking about health was not something for economists. Now we understand that economists have something to say about health system. And are our health system efficient or not efficient? How much has to be private? How much has to be public? Question like that. But it's pretty new. Education too. It's really recent. So it's capital theory. Okay, human capital. Human capital is fairly recent. Okay, 70 years ago, it was not clear that economists has anything to say about education. And now there are economists that spend their whole life thinking about education. That's new too. Law and economics is also new, that economists have something to say about the legal systems, not just the lawyer and law scholar, but economists too has to say stuff about the law system of a country. Is it efficient or not? Is new too. Urban economics, where is it? It's fairly new too. Okay, so you get more and more. So that's what you can. If you've already heard the word imperialism, that's what it means. You take economic tools and you apply it to basically all area of life. So economics is really expanded in terms of topics. Okay? So you see, I've been studying this transformation because it gives you an image of what economist is. But as I've told you, it's not a pure image. Okay? The one problem is that you use classification to classify research, but you also want to classify people. And if you classify people, you have poor relationships. Okay? If you give some class of economists a code, it gives them power. It gives them visibility. You can recruit people. You can have your own lab and stuff like that. And if you refuse to give them a code, you're threatening them, basically. Okay? So 2 examples. In the 60s, there is an influential economist called Katona who wrote to the people at the American Economic Association who were doing the classification and say, I don't like this, how consumer economics is being classified, because it's at the bottom of the classification with like demography and stuff that have nothing to do, and so no one cares about consumer economics. So this is what it says, basically. Consumers are assumed to be an influential transmitter of trends. Okay? So what it asks for a code, basically, saying, I believe that the introduction of a section heading, such as consumer behavior or household behavior, is indicated. In other words, if I want to be powerful, you got to give me a code. So people are fighting to get their own code constantly. Okay? So it's not, when I show you this and I tell you this is the picture of economics, it's not a pure picture of what economists are doing. It's also the results of influence battles, clearly. Lots of people are trying to get their own code. Urban economists have been trying to get their own code and they couldn't get it. Cultural economists have been trying. Environmental economists, this is really hard for me to say as a French, but so it's really, well, ecological economics, yeah, it's easier to say. Ecological economics is really trendy right now. So they also want their own code. So that's what the 90 classification, and they added environmental economics there because it's really a hot topic right now. Okay, but maybe they want more. Maybe they want just their own code for themselves and their own department and more funding. Okay, so you do have battles here. If you want to be established as a legit way of doing economists, you have to get your code. Okay? So it's not a pure picture of economics. Also, as I told, okay, so it's also not a pure picture of economics because, as I told you, many people are using this classification. Okay, so it's not just economists pulling together and trying to reflect what is our discipline. and we're trying to do that pure image of the discipline. That's not how it works. People are asking for classification all the time. For instance, during the World War II, the government is asking for classification, so government officers go to economists and say, we're going to draft all scientists into the war effort. So you gotta give us a classification so that we know who is doing what in the country and goes to that bureau or that organization. And so they ask for a classification, and economists give them one of the classification I showed you, and the government officers are like, it's not useful. This is not the classification I want. I want a working classification. And so what they do is, I don't know if you can read, they have a classification of 200 words of what economists can produce, like fertilizer, radio, drug industry, machines, engines. For them, an economist is just someone that can produce that stuff. Okay. So they're not interested in science or actually classifying science properly. Okay. So they develop all types of classification. So as a historian, I'm trying to take all the classification and understand why they live together and which one wins and why some wins and why some lose. Okay. And so when a classification wins, it's one picture of economics that win, basically. Okay? Is that okay for the moment? Or I already told you about that. Now I'm going to focus on a few questions. Just go back to this classification, but show you a bit more about the debates that led to such and such classification, because it's a more interesting part where economists disagreed. So I had two questions. I already told you about that a bit. That are so a big debate in the classification is about the stages of theory. Okay. So some of you think economics is more theoretical than other science, and economists right now think generally that they're more applied than other science, that they have more data, that there are more ways to test their data. Okay, so economist identity today is really about being an applied economist. Being about, I heard the word test, economists are able to test. So that's the trademark of economists right now. Basically, they argue that they are able to test assumptions. Do I need to give more aid? Or do I give more bednet? Or do I need to give more vaccines? Or what? So they have lots of ways, for instance, to help development. Or do I need to raise rates? Or do I need to raise taxes? Economists say we are able to test this and to know the effect of doing this empirically because we have data. Okay. So one big issue is about the role of theory in economics. Okay. If you want to make your science more a science, you have to show you have serious theory. But I just told you this is not how economists define themselves anymore. Okay. So what the stages of theory is something that was interesting for me. And a related question is what has been unifying economics? How do you know that something is economics? Is it because you have the same theory, which has been the case but is not the case anymore? So now you find that's a screenshot from blog post dated like 2 or 3 years ago. This is a blog post from Economics that promotes alternative way of doing economics, not neoclassical way of doing economics. And this is a screenshot from a famous economic blog. And you see the idea around is that is economic theory dead? Are we going to be able to just have a bunch of data and test a bunch of our hypotheses? Or do we still need ideas about how to regulate finance, but theoretical ideas? Or how to tame the business cycle, or spending? Do we need macro theory? Or do all we need now is data and testing our data? Okay, this is a big debate now. Okay, so that's the question that are going on now. But as a historian, I want to know how economics has been unified in the 20th century. Was it by theory? Was it by this specific knowledge that is microeconomics and macroeconomics? Or is it by tools? You also told me the economics is distinct because it uses more math or more statistics or more econometrics, okay? What is the unifying feature, okay? And you can see that, I don't know about this, so I'm going to look into what economists thought, okay? So when they did their classification, for instance, they asked themselves these questions. One question they asked all the time, in all the revision I showed you, is, should there be a separate theory category? And is it the most important category? Should it be at the top? Okay? Is it more important than the rest? Okay? So you had a category at the beginning, at the very beginning, that was called General Work Theory and History, but I told you it has no number. It was not more important. Okay? It only became important after the war, because economists believed they had somehow won the war with their new theoretical tools, okay? In general equilibrium, you've all been trained into general equilibrium, right? You have to tell me if you don't know what I'm talking about. So, so this is a model, and this is also a theory, okay? So after the war, there was a period of like 50 years in which theory was indeed extremely important. Economic thought, just like physics, if they have a consistent body of theory, they will be scientists. So they've been trying to develop primarily a consistent body of theory, okay, which you can see in general equilibrium, and which is why it sometimes seems extremely narrow to you. But this was the cost of making their science more scientific, more akin to natural science, having a body of theory, okay? So, but not everyone agree. It's always the same. Not everyone agree about the state of economics today. Some say it's good. Other people say we failed to predict the crisis. We have to change the way we do economics and stuff like that. So it was the same at that time. And now you cannot really see, you can see it in newspaper, but you can not see the whole of economics debate. But what is interesting for historians is that I can see the correspondence between these people. It's very important economics. These very important economists. So when they did the classification, there were two people that were fighting together. One was Fritz Matzlup, and the other was the editor of the American Economic Review, that very important journals, okay? One of them thought that theorizing was, you can separate the two first. So you can do only theory, thinking about what is money and what money does to prices, for instance, just in theory. Okay, so you could have a separate theory category that was very important, and then you can have all the applied stuff, knowing how much there is money in the economy and how it circulates and how you're going to test that. What is the GDP indicator? How much people consume? That was different. Okay, so that one was saying you have to get an abstract economic theory category, and this is where I would classify Keynes' general theory. You all know about that book? Keynes, okay. So he was saying, Keynes, for instance, is just thinking in the abstract. He's trying to invent a body and mechanism to describe how an economy is working in general term, in abstract term. And then what you have, so we have to we have to get a top abstract theory category, because this is what a science is. And then all the factual assumption goes into other category, okay? So for instance, Keynes also has written a book called A Treatise on Money that is very much more about how do central banks handle money, actually, have to do this, okay? So this is applied for him. Measuring the GDP is also applied, okay? So the two have to be separate. But the other one, Halley, did not agree at all, okay? First, he thought that separating theory and application was impossible. He said you couldn't be totally abstract. If you're theorizing, if you're thinking about how money influences the economy, about how finance influences the economy, it's always applied. You're always thinking about a situation. You're always thinking about a number, basically. So it's an excerpt of a letter he sent to Machtloop saying, is there any theory that is not abstract? And for that matter, is there any economic theory worth itself that is not applied? How about monetary theory, international trade theory, business cycle theory? These are theory, but they are already applied to a set of questions. In development, you need to have a theory about do aid help people, help country develop or not, okay? You do need a theory, but that theory is already always applied to a specific set of issues, okay? So without, you just cannot classify economics like that, with that top abstract theory categories and all the number. And not only is it impossible, but it's also not a good idea, because when you think about consumption, if you want to do good work about consumption, you need to have some theory and some numbers. If you think about growth and how to make a country grow, you need to have some GDP estimates. Otherwise, it's useless. So he said we need to classify all these things together. All the numbers for each topic, money, growth, development, public economics. We take the theory and the number and we put them together. Okay? So they really disagreed about that. And he said we're just going to drop theory from the title. It was not implemented, but he succeeded in having, for instance, growth and GDP analysis, consumption and consumption studies in the same. So they really, and in every revision and throughout all the 20th century, each time they revised, they were asking, should we have a theory category? And they kept a theory category that was very prestigious until, so I'm not going to into this one, until, so this is the 67, and they dropped the theory category in the last revision. Okay, so this is why many economists say this is the death of theory. Okay, which is not true. Okay, what is behind dropping theory category in 90 is not saying theory has become useless. It's saying we can do theory without applied work. Okay, so it's not really that theory is dying in economics. It's true that there are fewer theorists right now, and that what is getting prestigious is having big data and being very intelligent in the econometrics you do. Okay, the kings in economics sometimes are econometricians or experimental economists or behavioral economics. That's what's fashionable now. Okay, but it doesn't mean these people don't theorize. Okay, it means they are doing both at the same time. Okay, and so. They have been trying to, the theory category disappear, but not because it's dead. Just because now we are in an era in which economists conceive themselves as applied scientists, essentially. Okay? So this is not what you're learning, because you're still learning the theoretical block first and the technique first. But this is what economist identity have become right now. Okay? The second question is how. My second question is what's the core of economics? If it's not theory anymore, because there is not a theory category anymore, what is the core right now? Okay, so you've been in last revision in 90, theory was replaced with quantitative tool, microeconomics and macroeconomics, which is the three first course you have basically after principle, right? In the 2 first years, you're learning a lot about quantitative techniques, statistics, and then econometrics. You're learning your micro theory and you're learning your macro theory, okay? What is interesting is that they did it very late. So for you, it's not really late because you were not even born, but for historians, it's only in 90 that economists got the shape it has. Okay, which is why economists are not really willing to relinquish it after the financial crisis. Okay, it's fairly recent. It's really recent. And one interesting thing is that it was not difficult for them to do the microeconomics category. It's there. And it was extremely difficult for them to do the macro. No one agrees about what should be in the macro category. Okay, it took them 2 years to just draft the macro category. Where is my first version? So at first, the economist John Pencavel, he was the economist who did the macro category. So he was in charge of doing the whole thing. So writing quantitative, writing macro, and then urban economics, and then demography, and all the fields. And he was not a macroeconomist. He was a labor economist, okay? So he just he just made a draft saying, okay, macroeconomics is going to be about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and fluctuation in policy, okay? Which is more or less what you learn into your first course, but which is not, which economists said is not updated anymore, okay? So they said, many economists came to him and said, no, there is much more about macroeconomics, okay? You want to define the boundaries of economics, you have to put in your category aggregation, consumption, saving, capital, labor, because labor, of course, wages have an impact on how the GDP grows, basically, on the business cycle. Price, money is really important, okay? If you study economics, if you read economics newspaper, it's about the rate, the Fed moving the rate or not moving the rate like all the time. So this is also tied to macroeconomics. Government, of course, because the government decide how much it spends, how much it taxes. Macroeconomic policy. Then they added financial economics. How much do you need to, what type of market or financial market and the way you fund business do you need to have for a good economy to work well? And then they added macroeconomics aspect of international trade. And at some point, some economists were like, okay, that's the whole of economics. This is not a category, okay? You have that category grow so much that it doesn't mean anything at all, okay? So they made a separate category for financial economics, and they took other stuff down, and they arrived at that this is how macroeconomics is defined today, okay? But it is interesting to see that to define microeconomics, everyone more or less knew what it was about, like game theory, decision under uncertainty, things like that. It was very clear. And to define macroeconomy, it was impossible, okay? The economist who did the classification was saying, but if you look into macroeconomic courses, it borrows from all kinds of techniques, all kinds of numbers, from finance, from trade, from business cycle. It's impossible. There is no boundary, okay? So it's important to remember that macroeconomics category is permanently unsettled, okay? It's more difficult to understand what's the specificity of macroeconomics, okay? And it's important to remember that because macroeconomics is in crisis right now, okay? So if you wanted to build economics in the 80s and 90s on the basis of quantitative techniques, micro and macro, and then you get a financial crisis, you get part of your core that is in crisis, okay? So my last question is, what's next? I told you economics has been unified for a moment for the large period of the post-war by theory, and then the theory category was dropped because you had to do theory together with doing applied work. This is how it's done today. So the way to unify economics in the 80s and 90s was more about macro, micro, and quantitative techniques, okay? But this too is changing. One way to see it changing is to look into how economists define themselves, okay? So this is the title of a very famous paper. So at the beginning, I asked you to define economist, and you told me economists try to be a bit like physics, okay? This is also something that is past for economists, okay? This is how economists define themselves in the post-war, by doing more math, more econometrics, etc., okay? Now, from the 90s onward, economists define themselves more as like engineers. They want to think about themselves as engineers creating market, not just studying market, but really creating market, creating a market for spectrum, creating a market for carbon, creating a market for whatever, for health. Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
But why doesn't economics think themselves as economics?
Because I don't know. Because it's a newer science. Okay, it's a science that started it started at political economy in the 18th century, grows a bit in the 19th century, and really exploded So it's been growing constantly. Then there was a war, as I told you, and then it exploded, okay? So it's a science that has been in search of an identity. There is an identity for social science, and there is an identity for humanities. But as you understand, and as you know, because you've been studying it for 3 years, economists are not really satisfied with being purely part of the social science as distinct for the natural science. They've been looking for an in-between, okay? As you probably know. So they've always been doing analogical thinking, not just analogy. When I say economists wanted to emulate physics, it was just not saying we're doing the kind of things physicists have been doing for centuries. Actually, they hired scientists that were physicists and that became economists and that use physics maths to do economics, okay? And these people that are creating market, who got the Nobel Prize, like Al Ross, for instance. So there's been a stream of Nobel Prizes for these people. They have been trained as engineers. So it's not just an analogy. The best economists, some of the best economists have been trained as physicists in the post-war, and now some of the best economists are being trained as engineers, really, okay? Because it's not the same way of thinking. You've went from studying market to actually building them. So it's a different type of work. And to do that, you've done some game theory, right, all of you? So they use more and more game theory to build market, to understand how people coordinate with each other. We don't do it that much with general equilibrium anymore. We do more and more with game theory, okay? And now in January, so I told you about that big meeting with thousands of economists from the American Economic Association. This lady, her name is Esther Duflo. She's French, and she's part of this new development economics that are doing experiment. So she's probably going to get the Nobel Prize one day. She made a big conference, and she said economics should be more like plumbers. And she spent an hour and a half saying, well, the new analogy for economists right now, it's not physicists, it's not, she didn't talk about engineers or just a bit. We should be more like plumbers. Economists should imagine themselves as laying pipes and fixing leaks and stuff like that. She says this because she's doing development and she wants economists to think more about institutions, not doing abstract theory. Like if you give aid, what are the institutions of your country? How does it work? Is it corrupt? How do you channel your money in a country? How does it work? Okay? But when you do that, the economist is an engineer or an economist as plumber. What is unifying economist? What is unifying an economist that is working in development and in macro and in money and in finance? Is it really the same set of theory anymore? Probably not. Is it the same set of model? Probably not. So what the big reflection right now is about, are we going from for discipline united by a core and fields to an economist that is defined by its toolkit? Okay? So the American Economic Association is trying to revise that GL code classification one last time. It hasn't been revised in 25 years, and no one knows what it could become. It might not even be useful, okay? Because now when you look for, for instance, when I do research and I'm searching for paper, I'm not searching by GL code. I just enter keywords in a search bar and I get all the papers with the keywords I really want. So it might be useless to search for information. But as I told you, it was more than just searching for papers and information. It was really how economists define themselves, okay? So if they are going to revise the GL codes once more, then, but it's all guesswork, I don't know. The question that is behind a new sets of GL codes is what's the core? Maybe the core is not macro and micro anymore. Maybe the core is game theory, mechanism design, econometrics, a set of techniques, experiment. I don't know. Or maybe it would be better if there is a core that is still a theory and a different types of theory, like evolutionary economics, complexity economics, whatever. Not all people agree. Okay? Some say what unites economists today is just their tools, and some say we need to have a new paradigm. We need to have a new set of theories to think about the economy as a more complex system. okay? So I don't have any response to that. I'm just saying we don't know what the next set of GL code will be, but that will define economics, and there is very different identities at stake.